Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about emotional rifts in relationships. Alright, so before I get into the meat of the video, I want to give a quick at-a-glance definition of what an emotional rift is. So basically an emotional rift in simplest terms is when two people in a relationship feel an emotional distance from one another, where they sense that they're kind of alone with their own emotions and that they're not able to really communicate them to the other person. And this can happen in a one-way kind of way, where it's just one person that feels the emotional rift, or it can happen to where both people are feeling that way. Now, more often than not, this happens in romantic relationships, but this can also happen in platonic relationships as well. So most of my examples that I'll use and the way that I'll be speaking about things will mostly have to do with a romantic relationship, but it can certainly apply to friendships and familial relationships as well. Alright, so symptomatically, an emotional rift is like this great distance between you and the other person relative to the relationship in general or relative to certain topics. Like it's this sense of like being in the same room with that person, but feeling like you're very alone, feeling like there's no way to really make a point of connection. And again, this can be relative to just one particular topic, or it can be just all topics in general and feel like a general sense of distance. So oftentimes it's just this feeling of not being able to see eye to eye, kind of talking past one another, and having a lot of emotions with no place to go. Sort of like the emotions have to be like topped off here and like, held down in some way when you're around that person. And there's just an overall feeling of a lack of intimacy because one or both partners are not able to be seen, heard, or understood. Alright, so in order to understand the cause of an emotional rift, we have to understand what a relationship is at its core. And a relationship is basically an ongoing process of slowly, gradually growing together over time. And basically, we do this growing together through understanding that person at deeper and deeper levels. And this process can be lifelong because just like you can never get to the bottom of understanding yourself, you can never get to the bottom of fully understanding the other person. So there's always more to learn about the person that you're in a relationship with. So to give an analogy of how a healthy relationship works, it's like two plants in a symbiotic relationship with one another that slowly over time grow more and more entwined with one another. And all of the little leaves and all of the little vines start to wrap around all of the crevices. And it becomes like this really, really strong bond between these two plants to where the two become one in some sense. And so this growing together process and this deeper entwining of our emotional selves with another person comes from deeply understanding that person at an emotional level and really being able to understand their subjective experience. Being able to step out of our own perspective and being able to see things from theirs. And it's really just this process of opening your heart more and more to that person and learning more and more about them and vice versa. Alright, so if a relationship is a process of growing together, an emotional rift is an area within the relationship that the people have grown apart from one another because they're not able to see eye to eye and they're not able to hold space for the other person's emotions relative to a certain situation. There can be small emotional rifts and there can be big emotional rifts. There can be emotional rifts that completely cause the end of a relationship because it causes you to where you can't quite hold space for the other person in their entirety. And at that point, there can be no relationship anymore. So the cause of these emotional rifts is what I like to call an emotional wedge. Alright, so an emotional wedge is basically a conflict that arises within a relationship and goes unresolved. So basically, some problem arises and either there's no way to find resolution for the conflict, or basically both partners move on from the situation as though, nothing happened. But that bad blood still sits there on the surface because the emotional rift hasn't really been fixed. Now, palpably, this feels like the elephant in the room in the relationship. It becomes very difficult to have a connection because both partners' attention are going to go toward that emotional rift, or one partner. So one partner might be affected by the emotional rift, and that emotional wedge in the other partner, not really. So it just depends. But basically, it's this sense of like the relationship being stained with lack of resolve. So there are 5 main types of emotional rifts that I've noticed. So basically the first one, and I'll go over this one first because it can impact all of the other ones, and that's what I call trauma lenses. And basically what I mean by trauma lenses is like a person has the inability to actually see the other person and their perspective because they're orienting to them through their projection screen caused by trauma. So for example, let's say that there is a woman that was born into a family that basically any kind of gift giving or any kind of act of service that a person would do that would normally just be a loving gesture always had strings attached to it and was used to manipulate and kind of throw that thing back in their face. So what happens is that in future relationships, she's really unable to receive, and it can make the other person really feel like she's not allowing them to love her. So it might cause a conflict in that sense. And she might even accuse that person of nefarious intent because she thinks that, oh, if you're trying to give me gifts, if you're trying to do things for me, that must mean that you're trying to manipulate me and get one over on me, because that's what she experienced in childhood. Where the other person may just really genuinely want to express their love that way, and it might make that other person feel like they just can't get through to that person, can't love that person. So it's like one of these situations where the emotions of one person will be seen as threatening, and this can be on one end or on both ends. So both partners could be orienting to each other through their trauma as well, which creates a lot of conflict and a lot of emotional rifts. Alright, so the second type of emotional rift would be denial and deflection. So basically that's when if one or both partners are feeling a sense of discontent in the relationship and there's a conflict, that person will basically deny their part in the conflict and will basically try to deflect all of the blame onto the other person. Like a person, let's say, brings up, it's like, hey, I really don't like the tone of voice that you use when you speak to me, when you're angry. It's like, oh yeah? Well, what about that one time, 5 years ago when you did this thing? Or, oh, well, easy for you to say, you never clean up after yourself in the bathroom. So they'll just completely derail the conversation and do anything that they can to like push the blame onto the other person, making it impossible to actually meet that person where they're at emotionally and to resolve the conflict. Alright, the third one I call emotional ignorance. And so that is basically what occurs whenever there is a person who decides to take a non-emotional perspective in an emotional situation. So let's say that there's a woman and a man, and the man forgets the woman's birthday, and the woman is sad and upset that he forgot the birthday, and he goes, well, it's like I don't really make that big deal out of holidays and birthdays anyway, so it doesn't mean any of that. And she goes, well, yeah, I still feel bad that you forgot my birthday, and I still am feeling upset. It's like, well, that's not logical, I mean, it doesn't mean anything. I already told you that. Intellectually, you should understand this, and so it's like taking an intellectual or rational perspective when an emotional one is more appropriate in this situation, and this can also be used to kind of deflect from the situation as well. Alright, the next one is the one I called the shouting match, where basically both partners are just like going at it with one another, just constantly like insulting one another, disparaging one another, and it becomes about winning and losing as opposed to actually resolving the conflict. So basically any time that there's a situation brought up where there's a conflict, an emotion that needs resolving, it becomes like this fighting tooth and nail to be the victor in the situation as opposed to actually dealing with the emotional conflict in and of itself. And the fifth one, and I think this one would be looked upon in a positive light generally by society, but in a relationship it's a big no-no, and that's the agree to disagree. So basically that's when two people are in conflict with one another and they just agree to stop having the conflict and just move on. So in a relationship, conflicts exist for an important reason. They're a destructive process designed to actually get rid of emotional wedges if you use them properly and in a healthy way. That's what conflict is for. It's for resolving those emotional wedges so you can continue to grow together with the other person. And that's why conflict is a positive thing in a relationship. Now, if the people never quite resolve it and just decide to just kind of move on, then what happens is that that sense of resentment, that sense of there being an emotional wedge and an emotional rift just remains there, and it remains there unresolved and unchecked. Now, another variation of this can happen that's one-sided if the person just never really voices anything and is just kind of conflict avoidant and people-pleasing. Like they have a lot of issues with what's going on in the relationship, but they don't actually voice it and they don't actually take time to communicate honestly from their perspective. And so what either happens is that person just completely loses sight of those things and just has like all of this sense of like distance from that other person and just doesn't know how to resolve it. Or sometimes a person tries to put things away and then it just all blows up right at the other person. Now, one of the things is that, if somebody is in the trauma lenses kind of perspective as well, where they're seeing things through the lens of trauma, a lot of resentment will naturally build up behind that as well. So you really want to make sure before going in to resolve any of these emotional rifts that you are resolving your own traumas as well, because that will stand in the way of your ability to make that connection with the other person. Because if, let's say, somebody is dealing with somebody through a projection screen of trauma, what will happen is that naturally that's going to accumulate a lot of emotional animus underneath the surface that might have absolutely nothing to do with the other person. So you really want to make sure that you differentiate between an emotional rift caused by past trauma and the projection of those past traumas onto the situation, or one that's actually coming from the situation as it stands. Now, if it's coming from past trauma, I recommend bringing that up in conversation with the other person as well, because relationships can be a really, really important thing, in terms of helping you to resolve conflict. It's not something you have to do all by yourself. Alright, so the question from here is how to resolve an emotional rift. So basically, in order to resolve an emotional rift, you have to actually resolve the emotional wedge. You have to resolve the root cause, the reason why there was a growing apart in the first place, and you have to resolve it on the emotional level. Alright, so I have 5 different steps to doing that. The first thing is, before I go into those steps, is to make sure that you are actively processing through and becoming aware of your own traumas, your own wounding, and your own projections from there. And so you have to really differentiate between what's an internally located emotional rift that has to do with something that the individual should resolve in and of themselves, or what's something that's an emotional rift in the relationship, where there's just an inability to connect with the other person on the emotional level because of a conflict that arose. Alright, so the very first step is for you both to adopt a mindset of resolution relative to the conflict that you're having. So a lot of times when people get into a conflict, it becomes about who's going to win the conflict, who's right and who's wrong. But it's more so about, okay, where are we both at? How do we understand where each other is? And then how do we find a way to make those perspectives come together and to see eye to eye? So conflict resolution has to be the goal and the mindset. And you want to be really, really honest with yourself about what your mindset is going into the situation, because the desire to win is strong in us. And so we have to even actively watch out for this desire to kind of win and dominate the situation. All right, the second thing is to hold space for the other person in their entirety. That means that don't require the other person to edit out the way that they are. Don't edit yourself out. Everybody should be able to bring all of their subjective experience and their emotions to the table. This does not mean, however, that there's no boundaries. There has to be some firm boundaries as well. Like, we have to make sure that there's a boundary of mutual respect, and that this situation is about conflict resolution. Again, it's not about dominating the other person or proving the other person wrong. And if there's any aggressiveness or passive aggressiveness, this process of holding space for one another does not work, because you can't really hold space for someone else if you are being nasty to that person. All right, the third thing is tactfully honest communication and good faith receptivity. So tactfully honest communication means that you're going to be communicating honestly, but you're not going to be saying anything with that sense of like, spite or a sense of passive aggressiveness toward that person. You're going to be telling them matter-of-factly about how you feel and why you feel that way. And basically you're trying to be as thorough and honest as possible, and get a sense for really what it is that's happening internally for you emotionally and why you think it's happening. And the other person will do the same. And then from there, you have good faith receptivity. So good faith receptivity is basically being able to listen and receive what the other person is saying, and then taking it in good faith. So that means not assuming nefarious intentions to the other person. And you have to, of course, trust a person in order to practice good faith receptivity, because if a person typically has a way of going about things that is abusive or negative in some way, it's obviously going to be hard to trust the person and to think that their honesty is coming from good faith as opposed to a backhanded attempt at some form of aggressiveness or passive aggressiveness. But basically, you want to assume that the other person, in sharing what's going on internally, is simply reflecting to you what's going on in their internal state and bringing it outward and showing it to you for you to see. Not as an attack, but as just a, here, look at what's going on internally for me. This is what's happening internally. And it's this kind of like almost dispassionate showing of what's going on in the internal state, and being able to see eye to eye on that level that really helps that growing together process. And you should be doing this in your relationship even if no emotional rift exists, because this is part of what makes a relationship to begin with. All right, the fourth thing is to make sure that you stay in the emotional perspective. Very often, the emotional perspective can be uncomfortable for some people, and so they might go into a more logical or rational perspective, where it becomes about, oh, this is correct, or this is incorrect, or, oh, actually, you're not right in feeling this way, or, oh, you're, whatever it happens to be. So it's like if a person is, let's say, doing that open, honest communication with tact and is saying, oh, I feel this way and I feel that way. And then the other person shifts out of the emotional perspective and says, oh, well, you really shouldn't be feeling that way because this and this and this reason. And it's not reasonable to feel this way because this and this and this reason. It's like, well, I know somebody might be doing that to comfort the other person, or somebody might be doing that to shut down the other person. It could be one way or the other. But what it feels like is it just it makes that emotional rift all the more palpable, because it's a feeling like that person's not really being receptive to the emotional experience because they've completely shifted out of the emotional perspective. So you have to meet the emotional perspective with the emotional perspective. And you can actually have a conversation, the emotional part of you to the other person. So it's like a heart to heart as opposed to a heart to head. And then the fifth step is basically just to continue communicating and continue sharing until you intuitively find a sense of resolve. So basically, if that lack of resolve, if that emotional wedge and the resulting emotional rift has a certain sting to it and a certain feeling of distance, when you start to get more on the same page and you start to understand each other and you start to collectively resolve the issue of what's going on, then you can get that sense of growing together again. And it's really this intuitive process of sort of feeling out what's going on in the emotional realm of the relationship. And you can get a feeling almost like in your heart where you feel like you get a bit closer to that person. You can get this sense of like, oh, my message is now getting through. There is an active communication happening, and neither partner is resisting against the other person's perspective. Also, a big part of finding emotional resolve relative to those emotional wedges is setting terms in the future so that these emotional rifts don't occur again. So that way somebody knows how to respond in a particular way that's not going to, let's say, step on the other person's toes, or that's going to get them back in the same situation. Alright, so one caveat that I'll leave you with is that it's not always possible to resolve an emotional rift in a relationship. And this occurs when there's either a point where, there's just no resolution because, there's an incompatibility in the situation where it's best for one person to grow in this direction and it's best for the other person to grow in this direction. In that case, the relationship will really have to end. or there can be a situation where the person is not yet able to resolve the emotional rift because they're still playing through certain emotions that come from, let's say, traumatic situations and their wounding. So until there is resolve internally, there wouldn't be able to be a resolve externally. Now, one of the things that's positive here is that you can actually, like I said before, use the relationship to help you process through emotions. It's not something you have to do all by yourself. So, but those are the two situations that occur when emotional rifts are either not possible to heal or would make it very, very difficult to heal an emotional rift. And really being able to discern between a relationship that's salvageable and a relationship that's not salvageable is very important, because if you've both grown off in different directions and that's genuinely what's best for one another, then it's important to be able to honor that and to go your separate ways. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe, and also hit the notification bell so that you receive notice every time I release a video. And leave me a comment down below to let me know what you thought of the video. Also, I'm offering life coaching, so if you're somebody who is, let's say, in need of clarity or wants help to achieve your goals going forward, or just to do some self-exploration, I'll leave the link down below in the description box and in the comments section so that you can check it out. Also, you can go to thediamondnet.org for more information. Anyway, that's all I have for you now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.